All right, let's get started. Wait, is this too loud? Okay. So first, couple of announcements. Remember that exam 2 is next Wednesday in class, November 17th, in this class from 12 to 2 in this room. And it will cover lectures 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay? So from lectures 9 through whatever we're going to cover today. And since we're going to have the class, the exam in class, I'm going to teach next Friday on Zoom from 2 to 4, just as we did after exam 1. Okay? Any questions about the logistics for the exam? It'll be the same as before, there won't, no, it's closed book, closed notes, no cheat sheet. You won't really need it. And just in terms of things that we covered so far, the second segment, the middle segment, the most recent one, is a bit more advanced, so be prepared for that, since the things we're covering are getting more and more complicated. Okay? No questions, right? All right, okay. So last class, we talked, we saw some examples of how to design Turing machines for simple things. And then we said, okay, we're going to do it only once or twice, really, and just kind of get a sense of the power of the model. And then I stated without proof this have our cake and eat it too principle, right? So this is actually a theorem. So theorem was that every Python program for every Python program P, there exists a Turing machine T such that P of x equals T of x for all x. Okay? So for every program, there exists a corresponding Turing machine. And not only that, I also said that, the time blow-up is at most quadratic. Okay? And this is an actual theorem. You can prove it by looking at what's the core language, what are the core primitives that Python needs, and how you can implement them using a Turing machine. Okay? It's non-trivial to show, but you can do it. Whereas the Church-Turing thesis, that's a hypothesis. This is something, this can be proved. And then this Church-Turing thesis is a hypothesis. Okay? It's not something that we can prove because it's saying something about all possible physical models of computation. Okay? And the universality and computability results that we're going to see, they're also theorems, and you'll see full proofs of them. Okay? All right. So let's get on with this discussion of universality, which is, I think, really one of the most important ideas out of 20th century. Okay, so what is universal Turing machine? Okay, so the goal of the universal Turing machine is I want one machine which basically can simulate any other machine, right? So let me say U, which is I'm going to write a subscript Turing machine, and what should this universal Turing machine take as input? Any guesses? I want it to be a universal thing which can simulate any other machine. So what should the input to this machine be? Yeah? Right. So exactly, right? So the input to this universal Turing machine must be another machine. It's kind of eating another machine and a potential input for that machine. Okay? The output should be m of x, right? So this is another Turing machine and this is input. Okay? You might think this is weird, but I'm pretty sure you've used some model of universal programs already. Can you give me an example that you've used countless times so far? What is a universal something? Let's say universal Python program that you've used. Well, the Python compiler is exactly a universal Python program, right? Its behavior is exactly the same. When you compile and execute a program with some input, it's doing the exact same thing. Okay? So one way to think about this is that this is equivalent to compiler plus executor. Okay, you're combining the programming, the compiler, and the executor in the same go. All right? Okay. So to make sense of this statement, we have to first parse it, right? So this is a Turing machine, which is quote unquote taking another Turing machine as input. What does it mean? How can I take the Turing machine as input? Any guesses? Well, we can encode a Turing machine itself as a binary string, right? If you think of your favorite compiler or plus executor, then it takes a program as input, right? But the program is really just a text file to the compiler. There's nothing more to it, right? It's just a sequence of zeros and ones, which it then interprets appropriately by tokenizing the things into commands and so on, and then executes it. Okay? So we need to kind of set up the same notation, the same sort of language for mapping Turing machines to binary strings. So the first step that we have to do is represent Turing machines as binary strings. Okay. So just to recall, a Turing machine M is completely specified by its transition function, right? So I need to tell you what it does on each state and reading each symbol. And the actions are, you might jump to a new state, you might override the current one with a new symbol, and then also have some movements of the head. You move left, maybe move right, you stay where you are, or you halt. Okay? So the number of states is K. Let's say number of alphabet symbols, which can also change, is L. Okay? And so let's say for shorthand, I'm going to say the alphabet is sigma 0, sigma 1. Okay, actually sigma is confusing. So let me just say A0, A1 up to AL minus 1. Okay. The alphabet could have weird symbols too, right? Like we had 0, 1, the empty set, and then the triangle, that's a special symbol. I'm just calling them A0, A1 to AL minus 1 for shorthand. Okay. And we have to encode this entire transition function as a single binary string. Seems complicated, but we've done something even more bizarre before, right? We know how to map tuples of tuples into binary strings and so on right from the beginning of the course. We did it for circuits. We can do something similar for Turing machines as well. Okay? So let's go through with that. This is the description. This is the mathematical description. Now we have to capture this entire thing as a single binary string. Okay. So each transition if I'm in state, maybe S and I see a symbol A, I go to some state T, I overwrite it with the symbol B and I perform some action A. Okay, this is how each transition looks like. I'm in state 0, I see bit 0, I jump to state 1, I overwrite it with symbol B and then take action, maybe move left, move right or something like that. Okay? So how can I represent the entire transition table now as something that we've already seen? Yeah?
So you can capture every single possible transition. So it would be a list of tuples where each tuple is 5 elements.
Exactly, right? So we can represent the entire transition table almost like, just verbatim, right? Just write down each of these triples that you're going to see. So the punchline and what solves the problem is that I can represent delta as follows. I'm going to, just as for circuits, I'm going to, first write down how many states does your machine have. How many alphabet symbols does your machine have? And then start writing down all the transitions, right? So when I'm in state 0 and see symbols A0, you do something. Okay, it's a 5 tuple. Basically, what's the starting state? What's the red symbol, wherever your head is, and then whatever you do subsequently. Okay, and then the next one. Maybe I should really use list notation to right? And then there's a big list for all of these guys. So eventually I'm going to see a state okay? So just have a sequence, long sequence of tuples, right? And I mean, we won't really care about efficiency of the representation here, but let's just do some back of the envelope calculation, right? How many tuples are we going to have? So by a tuple, I just mean the sequence of 5 things, right? Starting state, symbol, and then the resulting transition thing. So how many symbols, how many such tuples can we see? Yeah? K times 7. So it's not very big. Okay? And each tuple contains 5 integers, right? Each tuple is just a sequence of 5 integers. The starting one, this red symbol, and then the ending state, the overwriting symbol, and then the action, right? I mean, the inside parentheses, they're also not really, I mean, they're not needed. But just write it a sequence of 5 numbers. I can say the first one is the starting state, the second one is a symbol, and so on and so forth. Okay? It's just a sequence of 5 numbers. And the range of these numbers is also bounded, it's small. Right? So for instance, how many bits would I need for writing the starting state? It's an integer whose value ranges from 0 to all the way to k minus 1. Right? Log k. for A, it's going to be log L, the number of alphabet symbols. Okay? And same for this guy, and this is just basically 2 bits. Right? I have 4 possible actions, either go left, right, stay, or halt. Okay? So writing each tuple basically takes 2 integers of size equals log k, 2 integers of size equals log L, and then just 2 extra bits. Okay? So how many tuples? And so each tuple can be represented using 2 times log k, that's 2 times log L plus 2 bits. Okay? So, I mean, that's pretty much it now, right? So, from the Turing machine, M now corresponds to, just to recall, let me box it.
Make sure that everyone is the same.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we can just, we can exactly use log k bits, then everything will be the same length. Yeah. I think, I mean, basically the question is, we want to make them prefix free so that you can tokenize them, right? But we can do that. Okay? Yeah, I was just going to say that, good point. So the Turing machine M is just K, L, followed by a list of tuples. Right? And we can combine all of these into a single 0, 1 star string using, what can I use for this? Just 1 second. How can I combine encodings of things to get an encoding of lists of things? Prefix free encodings, right? Here we know the exact size, so you don't even need to kind of expand all these things, and you can get very precise and pretty short notations, but you know, we don't have to worry about that. Okay, you have a question?
What is the capital A, which is 2 bits size?
Oh, that's the action that you're going to take. Action meaning where does the head move? Does it move left, right, stay, or halt? So there are 4 possible options, right? So we have to denote them, and we can use 2 bits to denote that. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, we are not really going to care about the size, but if you care about it, so representation length is going to be, you know, I need to write down k, the integer, which might take O of log k bits, L, O of log L bits, and then I have k times L many tuples. Right? So k times L times how many ever bits I need for each of these tuples. Okay? So log k for the first integer, log L for the second one, and each tuple is exactly log k plus log L plus 2. There's a 2 there, I absorbed it into the big O. Okay? So if I have, let's say, a 25-state Turing machine with 4 symbols, that's roughly going to be a string of length about 200 bits. A single sequence of 200 bits. Okay? That's tiny, right? Okay? I mean, I could write it down here today, maybe in 20 minutes or so. Okay? Just remember that, just keep that in mind as we go along. Okay? So let me summarize, right? So For any machine, I'm going to use a shorthand. For any machine, this is one specific way to encode it. There are all these other ways also, right? You know, someone might come and say, oh, I'm not going to put K and L at the beginning. Maybe I'll put them at the end for whatever reason, right? Maybe there is some advantage to that. Who knows? Okay. Yeah. Or it's not prefix free, but we are going to use prefix free encodings to concatenate the tuples. Right, so we have to use them to get the tuple encoding, right? So here, basically, we just showed that each tuple, you know, you have the sequence of 5 numbers that you can encode just being integers. But you have to encode a sequence of integers, like a list of lists, and we can use prefix-free encodings to do that. Okay. So to abbreviate, I'm going to say, for a machine M, we will let this, you know, less than and greater than symbol around M to denote its binary encoding. Okay. So, I mean, for instance, you can take your favorite Python program, you know, take anything that you've written in the last year. You can actually read it as a text file. First, it will be some weird thing. If you don't open it as using any editor, it will be some weird sequence of zeros and ones and some other symbols. You can dig deeper, it is eventually just going to be a sequence of zeros and ones. Okay? And we're just calling the sequence of zeros and ones this curly notation M. So now we have a way to represent any Turing machine as a single binary string, right? Just a sequence of zeros and ones. All right? And the specific way we do it is not going to turn out to be important, but you know, it's just enough for whatever we're going to do. All right? Okay. In particular, the text uses a slightly different representation of Turing machines as binary strings, but it really doesn't matter what exact representation you use, just as, you know, how you store, like, you know, whether you put extra lines in your code doesn't matter. Okay? All right. So one additional remark. So what we've done so far is that imagine you have the space of all Turing machines. Okay? You know, these are real machines, so I mean, I can't really draw a machine, so just imagine this is one. And we're mapping them to all binary strings. Right? It's a one-to-one mapping. We are encoding a Turing machine as a binary string. Okay? Any questions? And this is a one-to-one mapping, but it need not be bijective. Right? You know, maybe, I mean, in a specific way we've denoted this encoding. Probably not every binary string corresponds to a valid Turing machine, right? Just as, you know, some arbitrary sequence of symbols, you know, if I just randomly type something in your Python interpreter, it's not going to compile. It's not a valid program, right? Similarly, there might be strings on the right-hand side here, which might not correspond to valid Turing machines under our specific encoding. Okay, which is fine for the most part, but it's kind of annoying when we try and define things. So I'm going to adopt some convention. So to ensure that every string okay. So specifically, if it's not a valid string, if it's not already the encoding of a Turing machine, then just by default set it to a trivial Turing machine that always outputs 0. Okay. Again, this is not really going to make a material difference, but it's just a convention which helps clear out some things. So the message really is that don't worry about this annoying base cases or border cases. When I write down this M of M, don't think about, oh, what if it's not a valid encoder? Just always imagine that, every string corresponds to a valid Turing machine. If it didn't already in my encoding, I'm going to define a new dummy machine which always outputs 0. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. So now that we have this notation, I can formally define what it means to have a universal Turing machine, right? So I'm going to call eval And what does eval do? It takes the encoding of a machine and then input to the machine and outputs M of X. Okay. Now this is a function I'm defining. Okay. So a function that's universally defined, it always takes a binary string and outputs a binary string. It's a complete function. It looks at this input, breaks it up into some encoding of a Turing machine and the potential input, and then runs the encoding on the input. Okay. Any questions about this? That's why we needed this fact that every string corresponds to a Turing machine, because I wanted to define a function which takes all possible binary strings as input. Okay. It's basically like a compiler, right? Your compiler can take any text file as the input and produce a sum output. If it's a valid program, it'll actually run the program and give you the output. If it's not a valid program, it'll just say syntax error or something, right? Okay, so the universality theorem that we are going to show, which goes back to Turing, is the following. I think today is like the greatest hits of 20th century class. The two theorems that we're going to cover are probably the two most important ones in TCS. And this one goes back to Turing from 1936. He showed that eval is computable. Okay. So here, it could very well have been that this function, need not have been computable. And remember our definition of computable, right? A function is computable if there is a Turing machine whose output exactly matches the behavior of your function. All right? And later on, we'll see why this is non-trivial. Like there are functions you can define with similar behavior, which actually turn out to not be computable. Okay? But luckily for us, at least this function eval is computable. Meaning, there exists a universal Turing machine U such that mu of m comma x equals eval of m comma x. Okay, the output of this Turing machine exactly matches the behavior of eval. Okay, an important thing to keep in mind here is that eval is a function. There's only one such function in the encoding, but there can be many different realizations. Eval is like the specification. The universal Turing machine is like the implementation. I made many different implementations. Okay, and this machine has a fixed size. It doesn't grow with anything. It's a fixed size machine, but it can compile, it can run, execute any impossibly long Turing machine. All right. This is basically like saying that there exists a Turing machine that can compile plus execute Turing machines. Okay, it's like the first meta-circular evaluator. I can write a compiler for the language in itself. All right. And just a bit of history, there is like a long contest on, how big or small this universal Turing machine needs to be. And let me say, there exists a TM with 25 states and alphabet okay. With the encoding that we have, there is a Turing machine which is a universal Turing machine with only 25 states and 4 symbols in the alphabet, right? So that's basically going to be a sequence of 200 bits. So there's a compiler, a universal compiler, which is only 200 bits long. All right, which is very remarkable. Can fit like, it's what, 200 bits is like what, maybe 20 bytes or something? Very small. Any questions about this? And people have gone to great lengths to find the smallest universal Turing machine. If you make the encoding a bit more complicated, then you can design Turing machines with basically like 6 states and a few symbols and so on and so forth. Okay? And so the proof of this is actually quite technical if you don't use what we already did. And I think I flashed this in last lecture too, but let's see what Turing had to say about this, right? So he said, I think people were thinking along similar lines even before Turing, but he realized the importance of having such a universal Turing machine because it's a general purpose computer. It relegates everything, once you implement this universal Turing machine, running any other program just comes down to software, right? I have to change the input, I have to design the program that I need to solve the specific problem. Which, I guess he rightfully called designing software as office work instead of field work. And this is the universal Turing machine that he had. It didn't have 25 states, it had way more states and was much more complicated. He had to invent all kinds of things like multiple tape Turing machines, and then show that you can convert that back into single tape Turing machines to kind of show how to implement indexing and all those things just within this, in the same paper that introduced Turing machines. Okay? But for us, since we have our cake principle, we can cheat a little bit. All right. So let's go back to. So this is the theorem and proof. Have our cake. Okay. So if you really want, the book also describes how to actually come up with the Turing machine at the level of pseudocode that we used in last class. Okay. It's amazing, but I didn't want to spend too much time on it because we have some more interesting things to cover. Basically, you can come up with like a 3-step Turing machine which does that, and then you can convert it back to a single-step Turing machine. But what's the our proof of eval being computable? I just need to come up with a program, like let's say a Python program, which can perform the computation of eval. Okay, can I write a Python program which can compute eval? So if you think about that, that doesn't seem that complicated, right? What's the input to eval? I have a sequence of these 5 tuples, right? And then I have an input, and I have to simulate the underlying Turing machine on the input. So imagine we just want to write a Python program to compute eval. Okay. Well, we can do that relatively easily. And here's one code. Okay. So okay. So here you should think of this as a sequence of 5 tuples, right? So the machine takes a sequence of 5 tuples. The eval function takes a sequence of 5 tuples as input, which is being denoted as delta here. And we can interpret in Python as that essentially corresponding to a transition table, right? Imagine I write down, I first parse the input and split it up into a table. You can, if you want fast access, you can maybe even use like hash table or something. So it's not really critical. Okay, and once I do that, so it takes the table as input, input X, and I have to compute the output of the corresponding Turing machine, right? And we're going to do it literally, right? I'm just going to simulate the Turing machine step by step. Okay, so the tape, which is a new variable for us, starts empty, and you load it up with the input X. Okay, which is what a Turing machine would do. In the initial step, initial configuration, the tape starts with the input written on it. So we write that here, and I equals 0 is the head position, S is the starting state, which is going to be the state later on. We start at state 0. Okay, and you just keep running each step, right? So I look up the transition that happens when I'm in state S, and I read the symbol corresponding to where the head is. That's exactly the state comma I, right? So I have this tape which starts out with x0, x1, so on. Okay, and we just read, and the head index I points to start, and we just keep reading. We read it. I see what's the resulting new state. I update the new state. I get the new symbol, which I can overwrite, and then there's some action that I need to take. Okay, and then it's just a series of conditions. If the action says halt, you just terminate the program. If the action says move left, you reduce the index as long as you are not falling off the left of the table. Okay, says right, you just move to the right. That's it. Okay, and there's one thing here which is, in Python you can't just index into more than the length of the list. So when I increase this more, you just add an empty symbol to the end. Okay, any questions about this? Or as simple a Python program as you want. And finally, we had to compute the output, and I guess there's one typo here. Should be while j is less than I. Final head position. Okay. So while you basically output everything from the start to the final head position, right? That's your output. Okay. So this is a universal evaluator of Turing machines in Python. Okay. I mean, this seems very simple, but imagine doing this actually on a Turing machine, right? This is using some very powerful things that we take for granted. It is taking like indexing into account, random indexing, and then like if conditions, and yeah, all kinds of things like that. Okay, so this is our have our cake proof of things. We wrote a program, so we kind of know that there is a Turing machine which is equivalent to this program. So there is a universal Turing machine. All right. But if we really want to, we can spend like 15-20 minutes and come up with an actual Turing machine which is universal, just as Turing did. Any questions about this? Okay. So in some sense, the proof of this theorem that eval is computable is somewhat like, anticlimactic, I think. It's basically saying there is a universal compiler, but the proof is, we didn't see the nitty-gritty details, but that's okay for us, right? But before going on, I want to say a little bit about the implications of this universality, right? And as I said a few minutes ago, this is really at the heart of general purpose computers, which is a really important thing in our modern day-to-day life, right? We don't have specialized, we're going back in some sense to build specialized hardware for Bitcoin mining or something, but that's different. But at least in most of the 20th century, general purpose computers rule the world. Until people realize the importance of or the possibility of having universal things, people build computers, but they're tailored for some specific things like abacus for counting. People build special machines for adding up trigonometric series and things like that. But with this, you just build one machine and then program it to simulate any other specific task you have in mind. Okay, and this is also, as I call, a meta-circular evaluator. I'm evaluating Turing machines using a Turing machine. And like every Python compiler, for any language has this sort of recursive element to it. If you think of GCC, which is a C compiler, it's kind of written in C, which is bonkers, right? Like, how does it even make sense? At some point, you have to bottom out. Okay. And there is one of the most prominent examples of this is actually this, which is a universal Lisp program. Which, I mean, Lisp is again a very important language historically within computer science, in compilers, in programming language theory. And in John McCarthy's 1960 paper, where he defined the Lisp programming language, he also gave a Lisp function, right? He wrote a program in Lisp that evaluates an arbitrary Lisp program, right? And it's kind of really nice, right? Lisp was not initially intended as a practical programming language. And his notion, I mean, this function was just as a proof of concept, right? The fact that you can write a universal Lisp evaluator in Lisp was just a show elegance of the language. Okay, but his graduate student Steve Russell actually implemented this function in machine code, right? So he took this specific Lisp function and wrote machine code translation of that, and that's it. Now you have a universal Lisp compiler. Okay. So, this quote is also funny. You're confusing theory with practice. This eval is intended for reading and not for computing. But he went ahead and did it. That is, he compiled the eval in my paper into IBM 704 machine code, fixing a bug in this. There's apparently a bug here. And then advertised this as a Lisp interpreter, which it certainly was. Okay, it's kind of one of the first general purpose compilers or interpreters that people design, and it came out because someone was trying to show that you can have a universal Lisp evaluator within Lisp, right? And this meta circular thing kind of goes on and on. It's really fun to, if you ever try to write a program which prints itself. Okay, that's again a little bit like meta circular evaluators. Okay, I want a program which prints itself, and this is one such program in C. If I run this program, the output is exactly that program. Okay, and what else? Okay, let me go back. All right. So meta circular evaluators, and it's basically interpreters, compilers. Right, just as I said, there is a Turing machine which can be stored, universal Turing machine, which can basically be stored in 200 bits. There is like a C compiler which only takes like 2048 bytes. Okay, that's again amazing. Right? C is such an amazing language, but its compiler is so short. Okay, scary. And finally, universality really transcends the model. What do I mean? Just as we have a universal Turing machine, there is also a universal Python program. There is a universal Java program. There's a universal C program. Okay, and you can also twist things back and forth. There is a Python program which can run any Java program. Right? There is a single Python program which can execute any Java program for you, and you can just crisscross whichever way you want. Right? So there exists a single Python program which we really should just call it a compiler, right? Plus executor that can run all Python programs. Okay? And so on and so forth. there exists a single Python program which can simulate all Java programs. Okay, and you can now wonder whether the language Python is more powerful than Java. Okay, but really both are equivalent when you think of raw power, right? Every Python program is, in the end of the day, equivalent to a Turing machine. I can convert your favorite program into a Turing machine and then map the Turing machine to Java, right? And there's this notion of Turing complete languages. Tomorrow, maybe I can come up with a new language. I'll call it, dummy Python, where I'll remove most of the functionality except maybe 2 or 3 things. Okay? Is that just as powerful as the original Python? Well, check if that dummy Python is Turing complete. Can it simulate the single universal Turing machine? If it is, then it's just as powerful as a full language you have. Okay? And people have really, again, gone into wonderland with these kinds of things. So there's this notion of Turing complete languages. Basically programming languages which can simulate the universal Turing machine. Because once they can, you can pretty much run any program you want. Some crazy things which you don't suspect to be Turing complete are Turing complete. Like for instance, obviously Python, C, Java, Perl, all those things are. But even funnier things that you wouldn't think are Turing complete are Turing complete. Can you think of any examples which would be surprising if they're just as powerful? They can simulate any program. Yeah? Prolog, yeah. Yeah? Huh? SMB? Yeah, sure. Okay. HTML. Right? So next class onwards, we're only going to program in HTML. Not for visual purposes, but to actually do computation. And how do you prove it? I just had to show that it can simulate the universal Turing machine, and then I'm done. Things like LaTeX. Okay. And there's this, in some sort of esoteric community where people come up with all kinds of weird languages. Somehow the goal is to have the minimum number of primitives that will make it Turing complete. And the book, there's a website for it called Esoteric Lang, where you can spend a few hours. I didn't. But if you are interested in that kind of stuff, you can. Some really, really weird languages there, which also turn out to be Turing complete. There's a language which only uses like dashes, greater than, less than, and plus symbols as instructions. Okay? This is all coming out of this simple notion of universality. Okay? So that's one implication of universality. And what we're going to do next is kind of take this a step forward, right? So everything seems positive, we're kind of in this good world where everything seems doable, we can compute anything, I can simulate anything. I'm going to burst the bubble in a little bit. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll see some bubbles bursting and some hopes dashed. This is one other esoteric Turing complete language. I'm not going to say the name of the language, but it's just a sequence of, as I said, these symbols. And yeah. All right, okay. So just to clarify something here, so eval is a function. It's a specification of what we want. And when I say there is a universal Turing machine, I'm just saying that there is a Turing machine that computes eval, which takes an input machine and the input for that machine and computes the answer, right? So far I just defined what eval is. I didn't tell you how to write it as a universal, that there is a Turing machine that computes it. And here the theorem is saying there's actually a Turing machine which matches that behavior. Okay. So this notion of representing Turing machines as strings actually allows us to do lots of other things. It led to the notion of universality, and you can also do something else with it. So let's recall what we did, many lectures ago, right? There's a parallel. We had Boolean Boolean circuits long ago. We studied the model of Boolean circuits. We said, okay, we are going to represent circuits as strings. Okay. And this led to two things. One was universal circuits, and the other was a lower bound. That is kind of like a first lower bound. It's kind of an impossibility result. It said, okay, some functions need at least so many gates to be computed. Okay. And now we're going to do something similar even for the model of Turing machines. So we just saw how to represent Turing machines as strings. Okay, so we are viewing code as data. A Turing machine is a program. That's the code. We are viewing that as input. And then this already led to universality, which I think is way deeper for Turing machines, because somehow a fixed size Turing machine can simulate Turing machines that are even bigger than the input Turing machine. And the flip side of the first lower bound is also correspondingly much deeper here for Turing machines, and that leads to uncomputability. Okay. So as I said, we're covering kind of the greatest hits of 20th century. So one theorem we already saw, and it's deeply impactful in practice. Right? General purpose computers, of course, are really critical. The other theorem was also equally earth-shattering, but in mathematics at first, and also in computing later on. So what Turing showed is that there exist uncomputable functions. Meaning, there is a function that cannot be computed by a Turing machine. Okay, so there is a function for which you cannot write a Python program, even if I allow you unbounded amount of resources. Okay, there is no way to compute the answer mechanically by Turing machine, and hence also by other equivalent models. All right. We saw something like this already, right? For regular languages, there was a function which could not be computed by a DFA, but that was much easier. We just had the pumping lemma equivalent to that. But now we have to show this for Turing machines. We've just been arguing is very powerful, which can capture all kinds of computing power that you can have. And how do I come up with this function? What kind of function would be so weird that you cannot write a program for it, even if I allow you unbounded amount of time? Any guesses? Well, it's very hard to put your finger on it, again, because it's going to be very meta-circular. It's going to come up, we're going to use this aspect of viewing code as data. All right? And without that, it's really hard to say where uncomputability comes from. Okay. Intuitively, if you could compute everything, then some weird stuff should happen. And okay, so to motivate the function, and the behavior is exactly captured by I'm going to call, we're going to start with one base function, which is going to be the progenitor of all our other uncomputability results we'll see in next lecture and so forth. Okay. What is this function? I'm going to call it the toddler machine. It almost seems like a tautology, at least to me, saying toddler is uncomputable, but it's not as trivial as that. And if you have any experiences with toddlers, but they are uncomputable. So what's this machine, right? So what do toddlers do when you ask for a toy? Basically, they won't be playing with the toy for a long time. The moment you reach for it, they want it, right? And the moment you let it go, they also get bored with it, right? So the toddler machine is kind of going to do something similar. It's going to watch what you are going to do and do the opposite, all right? So do the opposite of whatever you are going to do, like the anti-mimic. So what do I mean by that? So I'm going to define a function which takes Turing machines as input. It's like a meta function, but it's going to do the opposite of what that machine would have done. Okay, so to make it more clear, let me draw a diagram. So let's say I have maybe machine M0 here. I can list all Turing machines, at least let me list some of them here. There's a 0th machine, there's the first machine, there's the second machine, there's the third machine, and so on and so forth. Okay? The exact numbering doesn't matter, but it's just for convenience, let's say. And every Turing machine corresponds to a binary string, right? 0, 1 string. So really imagine I'm just listing down all the 0, 1 strings and their corresponding machines. Okay? So every Turing machine, whenever I give it some input, it does something. It gives an output of whatever it has. Now, if you take it, yeah, go ahead.
Why is that 4 after?
Oh, sorry, yeah. This should be M3. As I said, I'm in toddler mode. Okay, so imagine, take your Python compiler. What is one nasty program input that you can give to itself? I guess I gave the answer already. Itself. What will happen if, I make the Python compiler run on the Python compiler as the program that it has to run? What do you think will happen? Well, it has some behavior, right? It should have some behavior. It has some output, right? So what Turing really suggested was this meta-circularity is very critical, and it's a real problem when you think of models of computation. Okay, I can give it any program itself as the input because it's just a text file. Okay, so what does a machine M do when given M as input? Okay, every Turing machine just takes a binary string as input, but I'm giving the binary encoding of the Turing machine as the input. I just want to check what happens. So in this diagram, let's say I want to write down whatever the output is in each of these cells, right? What do these runs correspond to in this diagram? And this corresponds to the diagonal cells, right? So let me emphasize that. So I want to look at what happens when I run M0 with M0 as the input, when I run M1 with M1 as the input, M2, and so on and so forth. Okay, I mean, this is not a contradiction, right? I can just give the program itself as input. That doesn't matter. So for instance, if I give M0 and M0, maybe it says, okay, output 0. Maybe the output is a bit string zeros and ones. Maybe it doesn't halt. That could also happen. M1 doesn't halt and when given the string M1 as input. Okay, all of that is fine. But the weird thing comes when okay, let me first write it down here. We are going to define the toddler function, which takes a Turing machine as input. You should think of it as like a compiler, right? It's going to take a machine as input, but it's going to do the opposite of what the machine would do when given itself as the input. Okay? As I said, toddlers do the opposite of what you do. And that's exactly what our function is going to do. Yeah?
What exactly do you mean by opposite?
Yes, I mean, I'm going to specify it very precisely now. So, it's a function, I'm specifying something. It's a specification. It takes a binary string as input. It gives a binary string as output, in fact, just a single bit. What does it do? It takes the input, not the input, it takes whatever argument you give to it as the encoding of a Turing machine. Right? So I'm giving it a binary string, which it is going to view as the encoding of a Turing machine. And then its output is going to be the opposite of what M would do on the corresponding input. Okay? Meaning, let's say 1 minus first bit of Okay, let me actually maybe write it even better. So there are several cases. You know, when I run M on itself, maybe it halts. If it halts and the first bit is 1, the toddler is going to say 0. If the first position is 1, it's going to say 0. If it's 0, it's going to say 1. Let me say. Okay. Whereas in every other case, it's just going to say 0 if not. If the machine doesn't halt, it's just going to output 0. But if it halts and, you know, let's say it's M of M also has a single bit output. If it ends with 0, toddler is going to say 1. If it ends with 1, it's going to say 0. Any questions about this definition? Yeah?
Why are we feeding M and including question 7?
Yeah, so that's kind of that's the genius of Turing, who said, I can define any function I want, right? So the hypothesis is that, you know, the hypothesis that you're trying to break is that any function is eventually computable by some means. And he wanted to disprove that this function, some function, is not computable. And in the next lecture, we'll actually see something even more basic function, which is not computable. But this is kind of, you know, the first one to start with. Yeah?
I understand the mean professor by the top of the versus one director. Explain how that links back to this like conflict.
So the intuition is that imagine if the function, if M1M halts, okay, it has some output. It could be multi-bit output, right? And you start reading the output. I'm only going to focus on the first position of the output. If the first position is a 0, then toddler is going to say 1 as output, okay? And if there's a 1, it's going to say 0. That's what I mean, it's like an opposite. It's the exact opposite if you think of M of M as actually a single bit output. If it's a single bit output, then, you know, whenever the output is 1, I'm saying 0. Whenever it's 0, I'm saying 1. If it doesn't halt, I just say 0. It doesn't matter.
Okay, but then if we have multiple bits of output, and we're looking at the first one and say it's 0, we care about what maybe the second or third bit is, or it's like
Doesn't really matter. The main thing you should do, maybe I shouldn't say opposite, but different. Right? Like, you know, no matter what you end up doing, I'm going to do something different from what you are doing. Okay, that's the exact behavior of a kid, right? You know, if I say, okay, today's pasta, no, right? The same thing. Okay, is the definition clear? I mean, it's kind of simple, just few lines, but I think it's really convoluted. Yeah?
introducing impossible behavior for
Sorry, I couldn't.
infinitely impossible behavior from
Yeah, sure, potentially, right? Why not? You know, maybe the machine is always going into an infinite loop on any input, right? It's just a while loop. That's also a valid program. I give it to itself, it's going to go into while loop. We just had account from that here. Okay? Yeah?
Did you know that, like, if the machine doesn't code, if it's just the output's going to be a codon, why can't we just like check for that and then return 0 if there's a codon?
Right, so that's an interesting point. And actually, when you run your compiler or something, it doesn't know it's a codon. It just has a time cutoff, really. Right, time and memory cutoff. It's just running, and maybe, you know, if I just run it on a bigger machine, or maybe for 2 more days, it's going to continue. So whenever you see codum, it doesn't really mean that you functionally are actually seeing an infinite loop. Modern compilers can detect infinite loops sometimes, but whenever sometimes they cannot detect as well.
How do we define codums for like Turing machine and content?
Yeah, so basically it's not halting forever, right? Whenever it terminates, there is an answer. If it doesn't terminate, we have this perpendicular symbol.
How do we know it's not going? How do we know it's not going?
So for a Turing machine, we can always define its functionality, right? Whether we can compute it or not, whether we can simulate it or not, is a different question, right? Can always define the function which is going to say if you don't terminate, output block. But I can't compute it just because you're just going forever, right? Okay, we'll talk about those things too in the next lecture. Okay, but this is a reasonably explicit function. It just takes a string as input, outputs 0 or 1. But the amazing thing is that this simple function, which does kind of the opposite of what M would do on itself, this toddler function is not computable. There is no Turing machine which can compute this function. Okay, why is that? Why should this be uncomputable? So for intuition, even though it's not exactly true because the output of M could be multi-bit, right? If you imagine, if I just focus on writing the first bit of the output in these cells, what toddler is really doing is kind of, it looks at M0, right? And then the answer to M0 is the opposite of what's written here. Okay, so imagine I'm writing down in each of these cells the first position of the output of M. When it halts, then the answer of toddler on each of these columns is exactly the opposite of what's written in the diagonal cell. Okay, does it make sense? So okay, all right. So why is this toddler function not computable? Any guesses? The proof is by contradiction. Okay, so let me give a hint. Suppose toddler were actually computable. What does it mean? Yeah?
So does it change the input to output bit by bit? Or does it take the whole chunk and like flips it and then takes another?
So it just looking at it's a single bit output. It just takes the first bit output and then flips it. That's all. It's outputting a single bit. So if my machine actually said the output was 1011, toddler would just say 0. If it said 0111, it's just saying 1. It's only looking at the first bit of the output of M of M. Okay, you can also make it multi-bit, but the single bit thing is cleaner, so I'm just doing the single bit. You can, I mean, for simplicity, just assume for now that all of these Turing machines, you can intuitively think that they're outputting a single bit as output. Okay, it doesn't make things more complicated. Yeah.
Is toddler a toddler number?
Yeah, exactly, right? So I should try it on my toddler. I tried it without success. Okay, so For contradiction, suppose there was a Turing machine N that computes Todd. Okay, so there are two ways to think about this. One, so let's see, write down first bit of output in each cell when halting. Okay, so I first write down this huge table where in each cell I write down the first bit of the answer whenever the machine halted when given itself as the input. Okay, then the answer of toddler for each of these things is exactly the opposite of what's written. If there is 0, it writes 1. If there's a 1, it says 0. All right. Now, if toddler was actually computable by a Turing machine, there is something in this huge table which should compute it. Right? The toddler itself was taking program itself as input and doing the opposite. But now what happens if I give toddler itself as input? Right? So if there was N here, what happens? What's going to happen in this cell? Okay, so let's parse that. So there is some Turing machine N, we are saying, which computes Todd. What does this mean? This implies that this is equivalent to saying N of X equals toddler of X for all X. Okay? For all inputs, the output of N should exactly be the same as the output as specified by the function toddler. Okay, so toddler is the function, N is a Turing machine. There's a difference. Toddler is a specification, N is our implementation. Okay. The question now, philosophically, is what happens if I feed toddler itself? Okay. More concretely, what's the behavior of toddler when given the encoding of N as input? Which is a valid question to ask because the function is specified for any Turing machine. For any Turing machine, for any encoding of a binary string, encoded as a binary string, there is a specified behavior. Okay? And intuitively, what's going to happen here is if N of N is 0, then toddler should say 1, right? But that violates the fact that N is actually computing toddler. Okay, so let's see what that means. If N of N equals 1, or okay, so let me write it differently. So I'm trying to figure out what's the answer of Todd when given this magical machine N as input, right? So what would toddler do when given this machine N as input? It would check what N would do on itself and do the opposite, right? So if N of N halts and ends with first bit of output being 0, then right, and else okay, that's the definition. I'm just kind of enumerated the definition. Right? But now here's the messy thing. Remember this identity. N of x should equal toddler of x for all x. So in particular, we should have n of n equal toddler of n. Right? The behavior should match even when given the encoding of n as input. Right? But that's exactly not going to happen because we define toddler to do the opposite. Right? So when given n as input, it checks what n does on n and then does the opposite. Okay? So which is a contradiction. It's confusing, but really think of this identity, right? If toddler is computable by Turing machine, then this identity should hold for all inputs x, for all binary strings. And I'm asking, can it hold for this one specific binary string, which is the encoding of n? Well, if that's what to hold, we should have this guy. Toddler of n equals n of n. But by definition, that cannot happen. Right? If n of n halts with 0, then toddler is 1. Otherwise, it's 0. Okay, so if n of n equals 1, then or let me say okay, yeah.
This actually, what if we just right at the paragraph that first introduce, for example, the app of n, like the app as the input of n, then do the next statement.
Right. So we'll talk about that in maybe a few minutes. The problem there is that you might not ever get to the second step. Yeah. So you're not computing the output there. Okay. And we're going to use that. This really, you're hitting the nail on the head. Or did I say it wrong? Yeah. That's really the main problem with why, that's the core of the problem of making things computable. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, does this make sense? The main contradiction is coming from this identity. We should have n of n equals toddler of n, but we designed the toddler function, we specified it to the exact opposite. Okay? And that's it. So this few lines, it's not really crazy, right? The proof is just like a case analysis, really. Just check, okay, if n of n equals 0, then you should have said 1. Oops, if it was 1, then you should have said 0. That's it. The ingenuity is somewhat in defining this toddler to actually do this kind of look at every machine on itself and doing the opposite. Okay, so this is a first example of a function which is reasonably explicit but is uncomputable. Right? And starting with this, we will build on it to get something much more like useful. I mean, toddler seems like a nice function, but it's definitely not useful, right? Just as all toddlers are. Okay, so I mean, like, who cares if this is not computable, right? It's some weird thing that you came up with. Why do I care? Well, you'll see that this has some strange implications about things that we as computer scientists really care about and can have a big impact on practice. Okay, and we'll see in the next lecture that toddler being uncomputable implies something called the halting problem is uncomputable. Okay, so let me first state this result and then we'll prove it in the next lecture. So what is the halting problem? It's really goes back to the question that was asked earlier about code dumps, right? Wouldn't it be great if there is a program, like imagine you have a compiler, right? There's a difference when you compile and when you execute. But maybe at compile time itself, you can predict whether or not you're going to have a code dump. That is really annoying. That would save a lot of resources for many companies, right? But can you actually write some software which can detect whether or not that's going to happen? Right? Imagine you're some banking company which is renting servers on AWS, but whatever, some software engineer there wrote an infinite loop. So you ended up running for a day, wasted $1 million, but then you just ended up with a code dump. Can you prevent such thing? So concretely, again, we can talk about a function which takes programs as input. Right? I want to take a program as input at compile time and tell you whether or not there's some potential input for this which can make it crash. Right? If there are a few inputs I'm going to run it on, then it's easy. I'll just maybe do some sandbox running and then I'll be fine. But I'm going to release it in the wild where someone can come and design the input, like try and spoil my machine, make it run forever. Can that happen? Well, I can define it, right? So halt of m comma x is 1 if m has a Turing machine, halts on x, 0 otherwise. Okay, so very meaningful, very important function. If I can do such a thing, then obviously this would really be useful for real systems, right? Okay, for every compiler, there's so many code dumps that you end up with. Can I prevent such things? I'm definitely sure it will save a lot of work in programming assignments and compiling assignments, but that's not its main use. Okay, but unfortunately, as we will see, that halt is also uncomputable. Okay, it's not just that this crazy weird function toddler you define that is uncomputable, but things that we would really like to have, which are practically important, also turn out to be uncomputable. Okay, and especially when you think of these meta problems where you're trying to study properties of programs, you're kind of reasoning about programs themselves. By and you want to do it in an automated way, then many things will turn out to be hard, will turn out to be uncomputable. Okay, and this is something that we'll show in the next class, that halting problem is undecidable or uncomputable, as we'll see. Okay, and remember that Wednesday is exam 2, and we cover all the material until this lecture. All right, see you next Monday.